Trump Tower, one of the sites of protests on this day, and the question might be asked, how long will we see these protests, these individuals in the streets from what appears to be all backgrounds, and where will the energy of those who feel disenfranchised, as Morgan was saying there, how will that be channeled next? Let's bring in Victoria DeFrancesco, MSNBC contributor and professor at the University of Texas, Austin, and Robert Trainum, MSNBC contributor and former senior advisor to President George H.W. Bush, here on this first weekend after the election. The two of you watching these pictures over the last couple of days, and is this surprising to you, Victoria, what you're seeing in the streets?
I'm not surprised, and I think because we saw such a divisive campaign over the last 18 months, culminating in an election that was very close, Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, Donald Trump winning the Electoral College, there is a lot of hurt and a lot of frustration. And I think the other element, Richard, is just sheer surprise. And just from a social psychological perspective, as humans, we don't deal with surprise well. And in the polls and the pundits, we had all forecasted a Hillary Clinton win. So it was not just jarring that your candidate didn't win, but that the expectations were such that the Hillary Clinton would win, that I think that is part of what is motivating this jarring sense of loss.
Yeah, if not tragedy for those who supported Hillary Clinton, going through that arc of realizing, accepting, and moving forward. And you know, Robert, one 65-year-old protester that we heard from said that she hadn't participated in protests since the 1970s. According to the Associated Press, they spoke to her. She described herself as an armchair liberal, but declared, quote, "I'm not going to be armchair anymore." Robert, when you look at this, what do you make of this energy, this multi-generational, if you will, reaction to the results of the election?
Well, it reminds me a little bit, Richard, of 16 years ago, when George W. Bush, as you may remember, won the Electoral College but lost a popular vote. The difference back then is that a lot of people could swallow that pill because they knew that George W. Bush, although they strongly disagreed on some of the policies, they knew that the country was in relatively good hands from a policy standpoint with respect to his temperament and so forth. To Victoria's other point, I think the shock here is that most people said, oh, my goodness, there's no way that Donald Trump can be president because of the temperament, because of all of the categories that he offended. You just going down the list, whether it's the Gold Star families, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's women. I mean, again, it just goes on and on and on and on. But the real question is what do you do next? And I think this is the beauty of the democratic system. A lot of Democrats out there should be reminded that they have a voice, if you will, in the United States Senate. A lot of Democrats should also be reminded of the fact that come 2018, there's going to be a pretty aggressive, I think, midterm election cycle. Yeah. And then again in 2020, the question becomes is who will they nominate as their next nominee?
Really good points there, Robert. And Victoria, to you on that, how long will we see these protests, these rejections of the election outcome? You know, put in context, we can go back to the 60s. We have LBJ. We have Nixon as well, where we saw protests for 1 or 2 years related to that president. How long will we see this? Is it going to be to 2018, 2020?
It may be, Richard. It's going to depend a lot on what Trump takes the presidency. Is it a Trump that stays true to his campaign promises, stays true to his campaign rhetoric? If that is the case, we will definitely continue to see these protests. But if we see a President Trump who comes in and rolls up his sleeves and say, okay, well, that was some rhetoric I used to get elected. Now I know I need to compromise. I know I need to get stuff done. I'm not going to go after the really combative policy measures. I'm not going to deport everybody. Then I think the protests may tamp down, but there is still going to continue to be a lot of frustration. And to Robert's point, that frustration, I think we're going to see ultimately bubble up in the 2018 midterm election.
Robert, when you're looking at the, go ahead and react to that, but how can he tamp down some of this energy right now, either by directly saying, for instance, I do not stand for these things I said before, also rejecting some of those racist memes that have come out across the country that we've been reporting on. What can he do to turn this around right now?
Actually, that was going to be my next point, Richard. A perfect question. Look, this is a story that is unfolding in front of the American people in their different chapters, right? So the first chapter was Donald Trump's candidacy, and obviously him winning. The second chapter, I believe, which Donald Trump can control, is his inaugural address. How does he bring people together? That third chapter is the first 100 days from a policy standpoint. What are the positions that he actually takes on the deficit, on the appeal of the Affordable Health Care Act, on infrastructure, on energy? You go on down the list. And then the next chapter becomes, I think, 2018, to my earlier point. So Donald Trump can control the narrative here. He can control whether or not he brings people together, not only from a policy standpoint, but from a presidential standpoint, and we'll see.
And his cabinet selections included in all of that. Robert Trainum, Victoria DeFrancesco, as we try to understand what's happening here in New York City as protests continue, and we're going to watch that as well as across the country. Thank you both for being here with us.
Thanks, Richard.